Welcome to Closer to Venus. I'm Johnny Burke, and today's guest is Jen Catlin. She is the Interim Director of the Education Committee for the Michael Newton Institute, a hypnotherapist, co-founder of Soul Connection Hypnosis, and a near-death experiencer. Today, we will talk about the expansion of consciousness and trends in life between live sessions. Jen, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
There's an awful lot of accomplishments in that little intro. How did you find yourself on this path? How did you get started?
So earlier in my career, I was a school psychologist and came from a very Western psychology background. So I wasn't always into this. I had some yoga training, and so I had some practices with that and mindfulness. However, I didn't know what hypnosis was at all. So I would fast forward maybe about 5-6 years after that. In my early 30s, I had a series of what's called spiritually transformative experiences, STEs.
STEs, yeah.
Yes,
okay.
and NDE is a type of STE, but I had a series of them happening in a very short amount of time. And things that people would start to think are weird coincidences, but they were things that went even beyond that I just couldn't explain. And so much was happening. I started getting all kinds of downloads of information on how to work with emotional energy and things I didn't know how to make sense of. But I had a really, really big STE at one point when all of this brought me into learning about what hypnosis is in a very strange way. I think many people, when we look back on our lives, at the time we don't know what's happening, but we can look back and see key players or key instances that happen in life. And it's like, oh, that's what that was. And so I had some people walking into my life who, one person handed me a book and said, I think you need to read this. This is what's happening. And it was a Brian Weiss book. And so that led me into exploring, I still didn't really know I wasn't into this at all, but there was something deep in my core that said, you have to explore this. At the same time, I have a very logical, analytical brain, very logical. And so my brain was fighting it the whole way. This doesn't make any sense. Why are you doing this?
And I know which book you're talking about. I think it's somewhat of a Bible for a lot of people in that space. So let's go back to the NDE. Was that the first ST that you had, or were there things that happened before that?
Yeah, it was not. For a period of about 2 months prior to that, I was having many STEs, many very strong synchronicities. Like I said, downloads of this information just flooding in, and visions of inner child healing and things I didn't even know about. And then I did go to hypnosis training soon after that. I felt like I was going crazy. Somebody led me into that book, decided to explore more about it. I was in clinical hypnosis training. I had not had past life regression training yet. I didn't know who Michael Newton was. I happened to train with somebody who was Newton Institute Life Between Lives facilitator and trainer, but I didn't know that. Everybody else was there for that reason. And so in the training, we were practicing just working on general emotional things. And I had a big STE where typically in hypnosis, your conscious mind is present. I mean, that's just how it is. While you're experiencing, something happened where my conscious mind was completely not present. And I didn't even have awareness. I was flipping back and forth. And so I was guided to another planet. And everything that I experienced there felt extremely emotional and more real than this life experience. And so then 2 weeks after that happened, I had an NDE.
So that was during a session, or was that outside the session, the big STE?
It was during a session, but it was prior to past life regression training. So I didn't have any training in that. I still didn't know anything about Michael Newton, didn't know that was even possible. And because the experience was so emotional and it felt so real and impactful, my conscious mind, when I came back and was emerging, because we were just working on confidence, like I had nothing to do. And the person facilitating had no idea I was flipping back and forth. I didn't know until after the fact. And I think had I been aware of that, my logical mind would have kicked in saying, what's going on here? Like, you're making this up. This isn't even real.
It sounds like something, it still does, something out of like a sci-fi book, doesn't it?
It felt like that.
And it probably felt like that. So before I forget, downloads, I've never experienced one. I have no idea what that's like. What does it feel like as compared to the NDE or anything that you can use as a comp in terms of in the spectrums of STEs?
Yeah. So I didn't know what to call them when they were happening. I say the word download because I don't know any other way to describe what was happening. But what was happening was I kept getting these very clear visions that would pop up. And in the visions, it felt like what was happening would take maybe hours worth of human time, but they were happening in human time within a blip of a second. It felt like hours worth of material. Yeah, that would then, it would be very, very quick. And I mean, some of them were happening while I was driving, and it was just floods of information. But it was like, even though it felt like it was so much happening within a small amount of time, I was able to make sense of it. I just knew what it was. And there were things teaching me about emotional energy, that emotions are energy, and how to work with them and process them for inner healing. And I had things about my inner child just spontaneously emerging. And these visions were sequential. So they would pick up where they left off in moments where I was just doing other things, like I said, like driving or something like that.
That occurrence sounds very much like what people describe when they have an NDE and they otherwise trip into, I guess, across the veil, where things happen. It covers a lot of ground, like you just described, but in like almost a nanosecond, but they're still able to understand it, right?
Yes, that's exactly what it is. And that was, I think, my first glimpse into, and I didn't process this logically at the time. I wasn't thinking about it consciously, but looking back, I can see that was my first glimpse into time not being what we really experience in this human realm, that is different.
Mm-hmm. Which we've all heard many, many times with regard to time or being outside of time, which my mind can't get around that. But
yeah, that's my brain has a hard time processing that too.
Whatever my brain can and can't process is not the point, but I certainly get yours. Let's talk about the NDE. What were the most important parts of that and the things that you noticed afterwards?
Yeah, so my NDE was a little bit different than some who might see their body. I had awareness just prior to having it that I lost consciousness, and it happened actually while I was driving, and I had enough time to sense what was happening to quickly pull over the car. I got my husband on speed dial. My body, half of it was paralyzed, and I was slurring. So I thought I was having a stroke. Later found out I wasn't. They don't know what happened, but I was having cardiac issues at the time from Lyme disease. I had been bitten by a tick. And so I got pulled over. I felt I was losing consciousness. And I remember thinking, because at this time I still questioned, like I didn't know if anything more existed beyond us. And I remember just having the intention, I felt very fearful. And I said, if anything exists, anything out there, I need help right now. And I just completely lost consciousness at that point. And when I lost consciousness, I found myself, I still had awareness, but it didn't feel like a dream. It felt like real time. And I was in outer space, and I didn't have a body. And it felt like my energy was what I could see, because it was very visual, was myself surrounded by this structure of very, very tall gems. They were like shiny gem, and there were very vivid colors in each of them, all different colors. And some of the colors were not colors I've even seen before.
Right. I've heard that before. I was about to say colors that don't exist here. I remember one of our speakers a while back was saying, well, there is colors I've never seen here on Earth. That's not normal. And I thought, yeah, no, it's not. Pretty cool, but definitely not normal.
Right, right. And I wasn't, again, thinking that at the time. It was just like, felt like, yeah, this is it. And so I was in the structure, and it was open at the top, and at the open to just space around it. And there was like a voice. I don't necessarily feel like I heard it in my ears, but it was an inner hearing that told me very firmly, I could sense that I had free will to leave that structure. What I felt was happening was that my energy, I could feel energy coming off of those gems. And it felt like there was a presence of others around that, supporting that. And it was sustaining my life, my own energy. I had free will. I could feel like I could leave if I want to. But I also felt like if I do, I'm not coming back. And there was a very firm, again, inner hearing of a voice that said, stay here, do not leave. I could feel that very firmly. And so I stayed. And that was it. The next thing I noticed, I just kept receiving this energy. The next thing I was aware of was being pulled out of the car by EMTs when I regained consciousness.
So the voice, or whatever the communication was, it sounds like it was telepathic, was telling you to stay and not go to what a lot of people describe as home, right? Don't go to, in other words, don't go to the Emerald Castle just yet.
Correct. And, the STE that I had 2 weeks prior to that was extremely impactful. Again, because that was another planet. There were other beings that felt like family in the sense that I can't even describe. And the energy of unconditional love was so intense, like nothing I've ever felt here before. And I have a very loving family, so it just doesn't exist here. I would never have thought I could make something up like that in my wildest dreams. And it felt so emotional. And so that's something that I later attempted to reconnect with. And what I got through hypnosis was this imagery and feeling of myself being placed on a boulder with this strap around my solar plexus, a huge boulder, and said, you're not going anywhere. You're not grounded enough right now. Because at that time, I just kept wanting to be there, connect with that, because it was such an amazing feeling. And when people go through STEs and NDEs, there's an integration process that needs to happen. There's a lot of after effects that people experience. And I was going through it, but I didn't know that at the time. And so I can see why at the time I wasn't grounded. I needed to integrate and to be here and to find my purpose and be in this life. So I think all of that, that might partly be why as well. I don't know that I didn't go out more, but I also felt like if I did, it was almost like I was so far gone. I just sensed I wasn't coming back.
And you could have stayed, meaning you could have not come back. You had free will to do that. Okay.
Yes, I definitely had free will to leave. I could feel that deeply. Like, you can go, but we're recommending you don't. And I could feel like it's not going to be, this isn't time. That's what I felt. It's just not time to do this.
Awesome. And it's probably something you've heard many, many times in your work at the Michael Newton Institute, which we'll talk about in a moment. What you just said about after effects, because I've had, even with the people that I've talked to with those experiences, many report things like elevated psychic abilities. Some even report that they have mediumistic abilities. And one person I spoke with said, I didn't want this. That's an entirely different subject, but this was a byproduct of his NDE. So you felt you basically experienced something similar to that?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that I came back with psychic abilities necessarily. What I do feel shifted for me was my fear of death was gone. And I was somebody who used to be terribly afraid of death and dying. That disappeared. And that's a very common one as well. People do come back. I've heard all kinds of stories of people coming back with different abilities that they didn't have before. I've always been somebody who's been emotionally sensitive and in tune with how other people are feeling. But what I felt changed, and it was a period of time after that, was an enhanced ability to just feel all the other stuff. And it was more on an emotional level. And what shifted was just this ability almost in talking to somebody, like if somebody could talk to me about things they struggle with in their life, just this innate, very quickly, I know what's going on, like deep down at the root. Like it's not about what's up here. And so I can incorporate that stuff into my practice with people. And I don't know, there's just the ability to like see past what the surface level stuff is.
So your empathic abilities got a bit of a boost.
Yes.
Yeah, that's what it sounds like. Okay, so that's pretty much in line with what I've heard before. Let's talk about your work at the Institute, the Michael Newton Institute. How did you wind up there? And more importantly, what did you learn there that you might not have learned anywhere else?
Yeah. So I ended up there because I happened to be originally in a training with an instructor who was Newton Institute certified. And again, everybody else I found out that was there was like talking about Michael Newton after a while. And I hadn't read any of his books. I hadn't heard of Michael Newton. But when I had the STE in that class prior to past life regression, some of the messages I received from those beings were, you have to keep going. There's more. And I felt this just deep sense of purpose in that. And so when I eventually read Michael Newton's books and learned about his research and that what I experienced was actually a possible thing, I was just felt drawn to like, oh my gosh, you have to explore this. And it doesn't mean, I mean, I don't want to give the impression that I was okay with it immediately, because when I had these experiences, it took me years to integrate and to be okay with it. And even to be at the point now where I can talk about it. And I'm very aware that much of what I experienced in Western psychology would be considered pathological or something like that. So I did not want to talk about it for a long time. And I've since found out people who have had NDEs have been sometimes labeled. I mean, I've given talks to therapists about people who've had NDEs and STEs who are afraid to tell their therapists what they've experienced because they're well aware that it sounds abnormal.
The average time between the events, and this is coming from someone from IANS, he was active in that organization for a while.
Yeah, great organization.
It is. The average time between the event and when these people actually disclose it is the average is about 10 years. We've had a bunch of people from IANS and some of the other nonprofits. They all say the same thing. I don't want to tell my wife. I don't want to tell my girlfriend, or I can't mention this at work. They'll think, I'm ready for like the loony bin or something. So
absolutely. And it's happened. I've seen people medicated. I mean, there is, again, it's part of the integration process. And I think it is important to get this out there. And I love that you're getting this kind of information out there, because so many people, even if they're not having near-death experiences, are having other types of spiritually transformative experiences. I'm seeing it every day in my practice, and people are afraid to talk about it.
They are. But I think that, very good point, by the way, that the stigma and the fear of talking about it is somewhat, it's less than it was maybe like 5 years ago. And this space, the life between lives space, once I found out about it and I started asking people, many, that were on the show, they would say, oh yeah, I've done this, I've done that. And yeah, it's just like this. And it's like casting a movie. What is amazing, every single person that I've talked to that have had the experience of that space in between incarnations, the details might vary a little bit, but the mechanics are almost identical. And so speaking of which, now I know that you've seen this in your sessions. Have you, in your experience, did you actually get to experience this space, or was it just like the NDE and the other STEs?
I didn't have a life review, or I've experienced those things in a life between lives hypnosis session. But in my NDE and STE, the STE, the big one, 2 weeks prior to the NDE, I would say yes. But that's more in Michael Newton's second book, Destiny of Souls. So like other incarnations and things I didn't feel possible. What I did experience in that same STE prior to going to that other place was myself as a light being in outer space with two others. And then there was a teacher. And the three of us were sitting there with sitting there. And we were just like energy, balls of energy, sitting there with a teacher. And it was like I was watching myself. And that felt more like a memory. Like, yep, like I remember this happened versus real time, where on the planet, it was definitely real time. But what was happening was we were in human school. And so there were the teacher was lighting up a diagram of what it's like to be human, like diagram of the body and energy centers in the body. And so I would say, that was definitely sort of more the life between lives space, along with the incarnation and other planets. And I'm sure we'll talk about more of that another time, but those things are all things that are experienced in life between lives sessions.
It sounds like you've experienced it multiple times. Speaking of Michael Newton's books, many of us have read Journey of Souls and then is it Destiny of Souls, right?
Destiny, yes.
Yeah. And there's so many cases, there's thousands that, as I described before, the mechanics, the details might vary, but the mechanics are almost always the same. So I think it's fair to assume that you have experienced it. That's what it sounds like to me.
Sure. Yes. I've experienced aspects of it, I would say. And so, even though it wasn't like life review or something, yes, it was definitely the life between lives space that was experienced. And I can say that now looking back. At the time, again, I didn't know what that was.
Another thing I've noticed is that I had someone on recently who does this kind of work. And what she says, with every past life regression, she always takes them to the time when they last died, right? And there's always a life review. And I've never heard that. Of course, I've heard a life review before, but I never knew a therapist that always went to the life review with their patients in each session. Is that unusual or not necessarily?
What I'm finding, it's not unusual in the work I do. All of my sessions, I take them to life review from a past life regression. I feel like that it's so important because for me, if somebody's experiencing a past life regression or life between life session, for me, it's not just about curious exploration. Like, we're here in this lifetime to experience and to learn and grow. And so I want to help people know, what is it about that lifetime or about whatever you're getting that is relevant and important for you in this life? And how can that help you? So the life review process can be part of that, because there are things we can explore around what's relevant from that time to today. But what I do find, and what I've heard from people that I've seen who've had other past life regressions, is what's out there in general, that it's not as common. And that was surprising for me. I didn't know that a lot of practitioners don't explore life review. They just stop at the death scene.
But they almost always go at least back to the death scene. And in some cases, especially if you're going to do more sessions, they might revisit several different deaths in several different lives, past lives, of course.
It depends, on the session. When I'm doing past life regression, I think it depends. In the Newton Institute, oftentimes when we're doing a single past life regression, we will explore much more fully, because the methodology Michael Newton developed is really comprehensive. It includes going back through childhood into the womb and doing a womb regression. There can be so much there in utero. That's like our first experience of coming into this life. And you have the consciousness of the soul, the consciousness of the human, mom's consciousness, and they all can overlap. And so there's a lot to explore there. But then it also includes going to another lifetime that is important to explore today, and then doing the life review. So if you include all of those elements, that in itself is oftentimes 2.5 hours, sometimes longer. It can be up to 3. So I think it just depends on the methodology. Everybody's taught in a different methodology. There's different ways to explore.
Okay. One thing I did want to bring up, because obviously you've had several different STEs. Spirit guides are beings that may be beings of light, things of that nature.
Sure. When I initially had the STE where I found myself as a light being, it didn't feel like a guide. There was like a more, I would say, experienced energy being with us that was teaching us. It felt more like a teacher than a guide. Other than that, I've had guides show up in life between life sessions that I've had. I did not have any guide presence in the other STEs that I had.
Okay, so you saw your guides show up in one of your personal sessions, or was that with one of your patients, one of your clients?
No, well, with clients, yes, they do often show up, not always, but I think it also depends where a person is at and what they're needing in this life. But in my LBL session, I did have a guide show up. Yes.
So are you communicating with the guide, or is the sitter or your client actually communicating with the guide, or is it both?
The client, my preference is, as long as it is possible, and to do everything as as much as you possibly can to get the client to communicate directly with their guide. So sometimes I'm telling the client, like, ask your guide this, but I'm not asking them directly.
Okay. Because I've heard that kind of contact can be a bit draining, as in like mediumship readings.
Oh, sure. I mean, even when we're facilitating any session where we're expanding, accessing expanded conscious beyond this body and mind, I've sat in a 7-hour session before. That was the longest life between lives. I don't do that anymore. They're not that long anymore. Actually, they're going a lot faster now. But I have sat there facilitating a 7-hour session before. And when I'm in the space, it feels like I'm energized. But afterward, it used to feel like I ran a marathon. It can take a lot of energy, because as a facilitator, we're opening up into that space too, to stay with our client. And sometimes there are mediumship things that will drop in and come in. And I've had that happen. I've had pings of things like, say this. And then clients tell me right after, like, oh my gosh, whatever you just said, like, had already just shown up, or I already just did that, or they're getting messages, and it's like, we're right there in that space. So it can be draining at times.
I've heard that quite a bit. Let's talk about the trends in life between life sessions. How do you think this might have an impact on expansion of consciousness, which a lot of us are hearing about these days, ascension, that type of thing?
Yeah. So something's been happening. Like you said, the stigma in the past 5 years is less than it used to be. I'm noticing something is happening probably in about the past 5 years or so, where there's just been a shift in the amount of people that I'm noticing are having STEs. And partly that could be because maybe my energy has shifted too, but other people are noticing it as well. And so I don't know how else to explain it other than, and this is only my personal belief, I don't know if this is true or not, but I feel like human consciousness is expanding. The veil is thinning. I'm having people reach out frequently about how even 3 weeks prior, they would have never believed any of this, but suddenly there's all these experiences happening, and maybe they're experiencing mediumship with verified evidence, or they're having other types of STEs. And what we're noticing in Life Between Lives sessions are that they have also shifted. We developed new curriculum last year in the Newton Institute to allow for more flexibility, because we're noticing there's not such a linear process that's happening in sessions that, used to happen when Michael Newton was doing research back in the 60s. People are connecting much more quickly. And so they're not needing oftentimes 45 minutes to an hour just to go through the process to get there and to open. People are accessing other realms. There's a lot of that coming through, and information that I think people are drawing forward to continue to help their development as a human, but also consciousness in general, because as each person sort of wakes up, and even those of us that have a very logical mind, if there's a part of us that's like, there's something about this information that feels resonant in some way that I want to explore more. To me, that is the soul calling. Like, yes, I exist. There's more than just this body and mind. And as each of us experiences that and explores that, I think we're all connected to each other's. Our energy shifts. And just by being here around others, it facilitates their energy shifting.
And every time we have these types of discussions, certain things come up: expansion of consciousness, ascension, people waking up, medium explosions. There's psychics everywhere. Some may not be that well trained, but do you think that's all connected as well? It's all part of what's going on.
I do. I think anything that transcends the experience of just the human body and human brain and opens us into that space, that it's all connected, but the pathways and the mediums for which people might connect to that are going to vary person to person. And not everybody's going to get there either. And that's okay. Like, we're all here to experience something in our own truths, and we need all kinds of people. I mean, you're here doing this podcast, which is not necessarily something I would be good at. So I think we're all contributing in our own ways.
Hopefully. I really think the Life Between Lives work is really important, because I think in just really basic terms, we're going to discover more about why we're here, what we're doing here, and what really happens when we die. A lot more than, what our pastor in our church or our imam or any spiritual advisor, who are pretty much consistently stop short of answering those questions, just because the canon of the church or whatever practice it is doesn't matter. Again, this work that you're doing, the Life Between Lives, is really, really critically important, because these types of sessions and the discovery is going to teach all of us a lot more about why we're here, what we're doing here, what our purpose is, and what really happens when we die, as opposed to going to church and listening to a pastor basically preach what he's taught. And, I know they're trying to do the right thing, and for many people, that's okay. But I think there's a lot more of us these days that think, no, there's more to it than that. There has to be.
Absolutely. And I think if you look, I was really raised in religion and in Christianity. And I think at the foundation, what I used to sense as a kid, I remember looking around the room and just wondering what is happening. Not everything is making sense. And I very clearly remember wondering about that and having those deeper questions. And I remember asking deeper questions, and I was never quite fulfilled in the responses I got. It didn't make sense to me. But I think at the foundation of all religions, the foundation is there. There's truth in a foundation of love and connection with others, that there is more. It's the details that have been, and how they've been interpreted over time that has shifted. But what I will say is behind closed doors, I have a very different experience and perspective that I've been able to gain over the years, because I have worked with so many people. I've been seeing scientists who are very, much into science and wanting verified evidence, but they're noticing yes, there's something more. I've worked with pastors who've come who maybe don't feel comfortable disclosing right now that there's more, but they found Michael Newton's books and it's opening them up, and they're like, yep, this is what makes sense. I sat in a church before, right here in North Carolina, and a minister got up in front of the church and apologized to the entire congregation. I didn't know this was going to happen. This was before I was even into any of this, who said that he used to tell people reincarnation and whatever it is we're talking about is not possible. That's not what happens. And yet he ended up getting on his own path and doing tons of research and found that there were references to reincarnation originally in the Bible that were removed.
Oh, yeah. That was during the 5th or 6th century. I can't remember the emperor. It might have been Justinian. It doesn't matter. That's pretty common these days, but with the evidence, not just with, pioneers like Michael Newton and Brian Weiss, but if you look back to the research of Ian Stevenson, he was the psychology chair at the University of Virginia. He discovered he could find children with past life memories that he can actually verify. And I think in over 1,000 cases, they were actually able to track down the family, and the child knew so much about the family, including secrets, that in many, many cases, the family actually accepted the child as a reincarnation of their loved one who had passed. And this is 60s and 70s and beyond. So
The research that University of Virginia has in their Division of Perceptual Studies is really incredible. And I have met some of those researchers at conferences I've attended to. I've gone to the IANS conference, and they're researchers. They're very objective. That's very obvious. And so, it's great because that logical part of my brain also loves to see the evidence, and that has helped me over the years. I don't question anymore like I used to, but I get that people do.
I always knew there was something more, but even when I was little and I would listen to, we would go to church. I was brought up Catholic, like a lot of people in the Northeast. And I just thought, they never talk about reincarnation, and something just seemed off. But that's probably a question for another day. I think most of us in this space have seen enough evidence and testimony where we kind of know it's real.
Sure. I've had the benefit of working with several people who've had near-death experiences in the life between lives space. And what I've been told is, in some of these people, it might have been 30 years after their NDE when they came upon Michael Newton's books and just searching for anything that could explain the experience they had. And what I've heard over and over again is when they came upon this research and this sort of map of the spirit world, the feeling was just excitement because this was the first thing they found that described much of their experience that they had. So the research tends to coincide with what people have experienced as well.
Very consistent. Awesome. Great stuff. Anything else we should know?
No, I think just knowing, especially for people who are interested in exploring that space with a facilitator, going into the life between life space. If you've read Michael Newton's books, the biggest thing that's important to know is one, preparation. Rather than just going into it, we have these human logical conscious minds. And so I cannot overemphasize how important preparation going into it is into understanding what hypnosis really feels like. Sometimes the books make it sound like a person is completely unconscious and somewhere else, and that's not how it is. And so just understanding that it's not always visual, but also knowing that the experience that you have may differ from what you've read. And that's because consciousness is expanding. Like I said, things are not as linear as they were. And regardless, there is something meaningful that is going to come up for you. And so being able to assess how that's significant for you in your human life now and your growth as a soul is what is most important.
Okay. I don't think I could possibly ever top that. So we're going to stop here. Awesome. Jen, thanks so much for joining us today. How can our listeners find you online?
Yeah, so my website is www.jencatlin.com. It's just JenCatlin.com.
Okay, cool. I will put that in the notes and the transcript as well. You've been listening to Closer to Venus. I'm Johnny Burke. If you enjoyed today's episode, please consider subscribing. You can find more information at closertovenus.com. Thanks again for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.